What tends to go up in value faster, a house, a townhouse, or an apartment? Hi, I'm Ed McKnight from Opes Partners, and in today's video, you're going to learn which one tends to go up in value faster, a house, a townhouse, or an apartment, and you're also going to learn where in New Zealand these trends tend to be strongest. Let's start by talking about apartments versus houses and townhouses together. And in order to spot the trends for this, we're going to use the king of all data sets, the Ryan's House Price Index. Now, this is a really high quality data set. And what that means is that any trends that we spot, we can trust in those because it is such a high quality data set. Now, what I'm going to start with is by looking at apartments versus townhouses and houses in Auckland City. Now, the blue line represents apartments and the red line represents houses and townhouses combined. And what we're looking at here is the average annual growth, but the long-term growth. So we're looking at it over a 10-year period. Now, what do we spot? Well, over the long term, houses and townhouses have had significantly more capital growth. They've gone up in value significantly faster than apartments. And sometimes that gap might be relatively smaller. Sometimes that gap is really large. Now, what does that tell us? Well, certainly in Auckland City, there's been a big gap. But let's see, has there been the same gap in somewhere like Wellington City, where there are also a lot of apartments? Let's look at it again. Again, blue line equals apartments, red line, houses and townhouses. Now, something surprising here is that back in the early days, kind of 2002 to 2005, there wasn't that much of a gap. And in fact, apartments increase in value over that long term faster than houses and townhouses. But that little blip, that was not a long-term trend, and over time we have seen that houses and townhouses have continued to increase in value faster than apartments down in Wellington City. And almost every data set I've ever looked at has come to the same conclusion. Houses and townhouses tend to increase at a much faster rate than apartments as a general rule. Now, if we look at all Auckland suburbs, for instance, and we look at which ones have increased in value fastest, we see a lot of central Auckland suburbs have increased in value really quickly. Now, when we look at Auckland Central, we see blue in this heat map. Now, what that means is that houses in Auckland Central or Auckland CBD, properties there have not increased in value as fast as elsewhere on the city fringe. Now, that's not because the land in Auckland City isn't as valuable. It's not that that land hasn't increased in value. It's because the CBD is chock full of apartments, and apartments just don't grow in value as quickly as other types of properties like land, houses, and townhouses. Now, if we were to map out apartments, houses, townhouses on a racing track, here's what we'd see. In the slow lane, we would have apartments, and racing out the front would have houses, and would also have townhouses. But now what you're probably wanting to know, and we get this question a lot here at Opes, is, well, what increases in value faster, houses or townhouses? And there is this real assumption that townhouses are kind of in the mid-paced lane. They're going to be somewhere between apartments and houses in terms of how quickly they increase in value. So let's dig into the data, see whether that's true. Now, in order to find this out, we can't actually use the house price index. It doesn't let us measure this. So we're having to use a lesser quality data set in order to figure this out. We're going to look at median sale prices. Now, because this is a lower quality set of data, we've got to treat it a bit more cautiously. And what I mean by that is we need to look for some slam dunk trends in order to have the confidence that we are making some good conclusions about houses versus townhouses. So bear that in mind. We've got to look for slam dunk trends. So to kick off this hunt for trends, let's bring in the data for the Auckland region looking at houses versus townhouses. We're going to put houses in red, townhouses in blue. And what we see here is surprising. A lot of property investors will be surprised by this because the lines are very close. Yes, we definitely see some difference, especially in those middle areas where houses were increasing at a faster long-term rate than townhouses, but we also see some areas where they are very close together. A lot of property investors will be surprised by that. To see whether that trend continues, let's again look at the long-term data. Now in the Wellington region, we're going to use red for houses, blue for townhouses. And what's surprising here, again, is how close they are. Look at some of these areas where, in fact, townhouses were increasing at a faster rate than houses were. Now let's look at our second largest city, Christchurch City, and again compare houses and townhouses. And a lot of townhouses have been built recently in Christchurch City. So there are a lot of people saying, well, is there going to be an oversupply of townhouses? Maybe they're not going to grow in value as fast. Let's look at the data. Again, houses in red, townhouses in blue. And what we see here is, yes, there has been a difference in that mid-period where houses were increasing faster than townhouses, but more recently, over the long term, we have seen townhouses increase at a very, very similar rate to houses. So while it is fair to say that there have been some periods where over the long term, houses have increased at a rate faster than townhouses, that has not always necessarily been the case. Now let's dig a little bit deeper and again compare those trends. Now, when we go back to Auckland region, what did we see? Well, actually 96% of the time, yes, houses did increase in value faster than townhouses, but the margin was small. It was only about 0.6 percentage points. Now, what that means is if houses were increasing at a rate of say 8% a year, then townhouses would be 0.6 percentage points below that, so 7.4%. So while it does seem clear that, hey, houses have increased faster than townhouses in Auckland City, the margin has been smaller than what some property investors would have thought. Let's look at Wellington, actually almost an even split. Houses only beat out townhouses 58% of the time and only by an 0.1% margin. So very, very, very close. Not a slam dunk trend in Wellington City, but in Christchurch, 71% of the time, houses were beating out townhouses with an 0.5% margin. So if we come back to that capital growth race again, we've got apartments in the slow lane. They're not increasing in value as fast. Houses, they're way out in front. They're the speediest. Now, townhouses only slightly behind houses here. They're not in the slow lane, they're not in the medium lane, they're just on the coattails of houses. And this is why when you're making an investment decision, weighing up houses versus townhouses, you've got to look at some other factors. So yield, location, and also affordability. Because what we know is that townhouses tend to have a higher yield. They also tend to be more affordable than houses. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody should invest in a townhouse, and it doesn't mean that everybody should invest in a house, but we're going to start to look at more factors. Let me give you an example for this. So you might think, okay, I've got to invest in a house because the growth rate is slightly faster than townhouses. But if your affordability means you can only buy on the outskirts of Auckland City and you're buying way out in the wop-wops, that might not be as good as a location compared to a townhouse you could afford that is further inwards in the city and is in a better location and so might get a higher rate of capital growth. So there are other factors you want to consider when thinking about your investment property. But let's answer the question, houses versus townhouses versus apartments. Look, no competition. Apartments clearly in third place. In first place, we've got houses, but townhouses have 1 foot on that podium as well. They are not that far behind. Now, if you want to learn more about property investment here in New Zealand, check out the Property Academy podcast because every single day we release a brand new episode to teach you something new about property investment right here in New Zealand. You can find that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast listening app.